By early 1945, Nazi Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting against extinction. The Third Reich, once confident in its lightning wars and grand visions of domination, now stood trapped between two advancing walls of steel. From the west, the Western Allies pressed relentlessly toward the Rhine. From the east, the Red Army surged forward with overwhelming force. The war that Germany had unleashed upon Europe was now collapsing inward, crushing the regime from both sides at once. What made this moment so terrifying for Germany was not just the scale of Allied power, but the certainty of what was coming. There was no strategic miracle left to hope for. No reserve army waiting to be unleashed. No diplomatic maneuver capable of stopping the advance. The Reich was being compressed, mile by mile, day by day, into a shrinking battlefield where defeat was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. In the West, Allied forces had clawed their way across France and Belgium and now stood before the River Rhine. For centuries, the Rhine had been Germany's natural shield, a powerful defensive barrier guarding the industrial heartland of the nation. If the Allies crossed it in force, Germany's western defenses would effectively cease to exist. German soldiers knew this, so did their commanders. And yet, even as preparations were made to defend the river, there was a quiet understanding among many officers that the line could not hold forever. German resistance remained determined but increasingly desperate. Units fought bravely, often with limited supplies and little air support, against enemies who enjoyed overwhelming advantages in manpower, armor, artillery, and aircraft. The skies belonged entirely to the Allies. German movements during daylight were nearly impossible. Fuel shortages crippled armored divisions. Entire formations were shadows of their former strength. Courage was abundant, but resources were not. In the east, the situation was even more catastrophic. The Red Army had already smashed through German defenses in Poland and was driving westward at a pace that stunned even Allied observers. Soviet forces advanced not as a single spearhead, but as a massive, rolling front, consuming territory with relentless momentum. German defensive lines collapsed almost as soon as they were formed. Cities fell in days. Some units barely had time to dig trenches before being overrun. This was not a war of maneuver anymore. It was a war of exhaustion, and Germany had nothing left to give. Inside the German high command, fear and frustration mounted. Reports from both fronts painted a grim picture. In the West, Allied armies coordinated their movements with increasing efficiency, tightening their grip on the Rhine. In the East, Soviet advances were measured not in miles, but in entire regions lost within weeks. The Reich was being pulled apart faster than Berlin could respond. At the center of it all sat Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from reality. He refused to accept the scale of the disaster unfolding around him. Setbacks were blamed on betrayal, cowardice, or incompetence, not on his own strategic failures. Orders were issued demanding counterattacks that no longer made sense and could not be carried out. Officers who questioned these commands risked dismissal, or worse. Hitler's leadership had become openly destructive. Trust between the Führer and his generals evaporated. Commanders were dismissed, reinstated, and dismissed again in rapid succession. Executions were carried out to enforce loyalty. Fear replaced strategy. Desperation replaced planning. The Nazi leadership structure, once rigid and centralized, began to fracture under the strain of inevitable defeat. And yet, despite everything, the fighting continued. German soldiers along the Rhine prepared for what they knew was coming. Bridges were rigged with explosives. Defensive positions were hastily reinforced. Orders were clear. The river must not be crossed. Hitler had declared it the final western barrier of the Reich. Losing it would mean opening the door to the heart of Germany itself. Across the river, Allied commanders studied maps, assessed German positions, and debated how best to deliver the final blow. The challenge was immense. The Rhine was wide, fast-moving, and heavily defended. A failed crossing could cost thousands of lives. Timing, coordination, and deception would be crucial. The Western Allies were determined not just to cross the river, but to do so in a way that would shatter what remained of German resistance. Meanwhile, German civilians felt the war closing in around them. Cities were in ruins. Refugees flooded westward from the advancing Red Army. Food shortages worsened, Air raids continued relentlessly. The once confident propaganda of the Nazi regime rang hollow against the reality of destroyed neighborhoods and endless columns of wounded soldiers. Faith in victory had vanished. Survival became the only concern. By early 1945, even within Nazi circles, there was a quiet understanding that the end was near. But there would be no surrender. Hitler had made that clear. Germany would fight until the last moment, regardless of the cost. The Reich would not collapse peacefully, it would be crushed. By May, Adolf Hitler would be dead. Germany would lie in ruins. The war in Europe would be over. But in these early months of 1945, the final struggle was still unfolding, brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. If you want more deeply researched, immersive World War II history like this, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps ensure these stories reach more people who want to understand how history truly unfolded. Germany now stood between two unstoppable forces. The Rhine awaited its fate. In the east, the Soviet armies gathered strength for the final drive toward Berlin. And in the center of it all, a regime already defeated refused to admit it. The vice was tightening, and it was about to close.